Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Richard. How are you? How was the week?
Great week, actually. Lots of fun things going on. Obviously, it's still the summer here, and we're still enjoying the best part of the year. At least it's my. I know a lot of people who live in New England, their best season is fall, but I'm not. Yeah, I'm still a summer guy. I grew up in South Africa,
Really?
just like as you grew up in the Caribbean. It's like, hey, sometimes you just got to have a little sun.
I love the sun, but I'll tell you, I do miss the fall. Being down here, I miss the change in the smell of the air. I miss the
Oh yeah,
colors. I miss the
yeah,
mountains. I'm going to be coming back up to New England this fall. I'm going to be talking at a
great.
conference at the Intercontinental. I'll share some more details for the listeners. If you're in the Boston, New England area and you're looking to learn more about how AI can grow with your business, how you can develop strategy around AI, if you're interested in AI literacy, that's a conference that you absolutely cannot miss. So look out for more details on that.
Excellent. And you've also been busy. You've been working with EO this week.
Yes, this is our second week with EO, and we're working with over 2,000 business leaders, entrepreneurs, founders that are looking to build digital strategies. So, not just thinking about AI specifically, but just overall what AI means for the rest of their business strategy, what other tools they may be looking to leverage. We've had 4 sessions so far, and people are absolutely loving it. We've been getting great feedback, lots of exciting questions. We have one more session this week and then a Q&A. And then in September, we're going to be doing a follow-on session that we're going to be announcing this week. So lots of exciting things on that front also.
Yeah, if anybody's listening, this is actually something that Chris and I offer. If you want to dig deep into the AI literacy for your organization or your company or your product, you can hire us. We provide both the speaking and facilitation and workshop services that allow you to get your team up to speed. Yeah, that's the timeshare part of this episode. We're available for hire, and we love working with these large organizations that are making a big impact on entrepreneurship and on the business sector.
Awesome. So why don't we dive in? What a week, Richard. So many
Yeah.
different stories across the spectrum. What were your big takeaways in terms of the top stories this week before we dive into the topics?
Generally, I think it's a lot of more of the same. There is a little bit of a standoff between the Llama open source approach and what OpenAI is advocating for. And we can talk about that in more depth right now. But also, yeah, I think what we're just seeing is, if you watch where the money goes, which is always like an ideal place to understand where this thing is, we're seeing organizations that provide services to AI. We're seeing money go to organizations that are providing the infrastructure, but still we're not quite seeing where that product is landing. There are exceptions, right? So we're seeing Adobe is a really good example. They have an installed base. They've got a great product deliveries mechanism under that leadership. And so we're seeing them deliver product that has AI capabilities. But we're not seeing this across the board, right? We're not seeing everybody turn around and say, gee, my job just got replaced by AI. However, in anticipation of productivity gains, companies are laying off people, anticipating that they'll have more bandwidth for these efficiencies. So we can talk about that as well. And I think you've got some insights into the specific money play, like where the money is actually going. Yeah. But I think generally what I'm seeing is more of the same and more of what we've predicted, right? We've said this is going to take a while for the product to actually land in the market. We've said the money is chasing infrastructure at the moment. That's normal. Obviously, the service providers, the big consulting companies, they're getting in on the action early. But I'm also a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to that kind of stuff, because I also see that the hype needs to play out. And I think we've got a while to go before we actually see some of this stuff landing in product in teams' hands.
Love it. All right. So we're going to dive into some really interesting stories. But if you're new here, head on over to Maginative.com. You'll be able to see all the top stories that we covered this week, from companies like Here raising $500 million, the new products coming out from Adobe that Richard touched on, new open source models, new closed source models, new search tools. So many fun stories to check out. We're going to have you rely on the website to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of just going over the news or subscribing to our newsletter. We'll send out a digest of the top stories every week. But on the podcast, in these conversations, we want to take the top themes. We want to talk about how they're impacting the real world, real people, real jobs, how you can implement them within your organization, how you might need to change your strategy as the ground beneath you is shifting. And I love the stories this week because the themes are starting to become clearer, right? On one side, you're seeing the Zuckerbergs of the world that are setting their camp around open source. And they're saying, this is our vision of the future. Not just, hey, this is what we want to do now, but this is our vision of what AI looks like in the future. And on the other hand, you have the Sam Altmans of the world that are saying, hey, this is why we think we need to be closed source. We started out as open source. We're closed source. No, this is why. The other theme that I'd want you to just keep an eye on, because one of the things that you'll notice, in my opinion, is that even though a lot of people might say, hey, there's not a lot happening in this space, because we cover it so closely, we see the things that go unsaid, right? Like this week, Google also had their earnings and they had a massive drop because I think expectations weren't aligned in terms of what AI would be delivering for their bottom line versus the investment and the cost that will obviously go on for a while, right? And so I think you'll start to see a lot more of that as the market starts to catch up in terms of what the reality will be in terms of the valuations on a lot of these companies and the expectations in terms of revenue and the time where that is going to be coming to fore. And then, of course, the products that we're starting to see, which are the companies that are actually successfully delivering products, successfully adding value to their customer base, and not just leaning too heavily on AI.
Let's talk specifically about this open source, closed source thing, because you've written an op-ed. People can go to the website and dig in on that. But I think it's a big story in the sense of like, where does open source actually benefit either the company that's providing that or the market that's actually receiving those services?
I do think there is a massive opportunity and a massive role for open source to play within the community. I'm a big advocate and proponent of open source technologies. I use them. I have contributed to open source technologies in the past. And when it comes to AI specifically, I think there is a massive need for an open source community. So if you're a business, open source is going to hopefully save you money. It's going to give you more options and flexibility. And most importantly, it's going to give you the control that you will ultimately want over your products, your output, etc. There are lots of examples. You saw when Lama came to the market, when Mistral came to the market, these companies really led in terms of their approach to releasing technologies. But also you saw the community respond by taking these technologies, build on them, iterate on them, and you saw rapid growth and evolution within the space. And so all of a sudden you had really capable smaller models that companies could run rather than relying on the larger models coming from the Geminis and the Claudes and the GPTs of the world. And then you also saw a lot more experimentation in terms of where these models could be used, how they could be made safer. And so overall, the open source community, because you have so many eyes on the technology, because you have so many participants, the theory is that you're going to have a faster, more robust product that everyone gets access to. And as you know, we're big advocates of making AI that is maximally beneficial to as many people as possible. And so when you're thinking of people in developing countries, people with less resources as a business, and open source technology is certainly going to be much more appealing than a closed source one. So that's one side of the coin. And I think it's noble. I think companies that invest in open source are great. But I think we also need to be very real in terms of the other side of the coin. We are developing, after all, a technology that we think is very dangerous and that requires more oversight. So I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about like what the disadvantages that I see in terms of the approach to open source with AI specifically. But just to kick things off, of course, I think if you're a company and you're thinking, okay, should I be looking at open source models? I think absolutely. there are lots of smaller open source models that can do a lot of what you need to get done from a language processing standpoint or maybe an automation standpoint. So you may not need a massive model. You can just use a smaller model. It will save you time. It will be faster. It will be a better experience. And it's a nice way for you to sometimes prototype before investing in a more capable model. And I think the future will likely be a hybrid of on-device AI, cloud AI, open source AI, and closed AI.
The concern, of course, is at the macro level is security, right? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
You mentioned Sam Altman. He has a particular point of view on this, and I don't think it's only his. Like there is definitely like a kind of a general concern that AI, because it is potentially dangerous, should have a lot more security guardrails around it.
So there's this interesting theme that you see within the tech community, within the AI community specifically around open AI. They sometimes get this rap that, hey, they're behind or they're falling behind. I'm going to put my foot down and make my prediction. Open AI remains 1 to 2 years ahead of the entire industry. I don't think anybody right now is anywhere close to the technology that Open AI has. And I think we're going to see, as Sam says, almost warns, an explosion of intelligence and technology over the coming months and years. I think we've seen OpenAI slow down because they have been very deliberate about security and safety. I think they released ChatGPT. They didn't really anticipate some of the use cases, some of the scenarios that they would find themselves in. I think they've been responsible in terms of not trying to release another model and another model like a lot of the other companies that are playing catch up. They've slowed down to say, okay, how can we make this useful? How can we make this safer? Along with Anthropic, along with Microsoft, along with Google, they have put out lots of papers on AI safety and securing AI infrastructure. Because one of the big articles that they wrote and Anthropic has been behind is how do you actually secure the companies and the technology itself?
Yeah.
These are, of course, startups sometimes, and they don't think a lot about espionage and anybody trying to access their technology. And we saw massive security breaches in the past. We have seen massive technology fails, even last week with CrowdStrike. And so how do you take the time to have the proper development and delivery practices to ensure that there's security at the physical level around these systems, that there's security at the operational level around who has access to them, and there's security even at the data level as to what's going inside of these systems. There are so many different ways in which you're seeing adversaries try to take advantage of these models, poisoning the data that they're being trained on level. So they're really smart and interesting in ways that they now have to start thinking about, okay, how can we prepare for a world where this technology can be powering so many critical infrastructure and important tools and processes and be responsible at the same time. So the first thing I would say is I think the slowdown that you have seen over the last year with OpenAI releases, I get that people are frustrated that they don't just drop their models like some of the other companies and you can access it. I think there is reason and method to them not releasing, for example, a Sora in an election year when they probably anticipate that this can cause havoc in a society that's not prepared for deepfakes. And so they show the preview, the technology is there, but they're saying, hey, you know what? Let's probably wait until later in the year before we release a technology like this, right? We see them with their multimodal AIs where they show the preview again and they're being very thoughtful and almost slow walking the release of these tools. And on one hand, I think there's this argument that it's vaporware and it's not there. And on the other, I would advocate that I think they're doing the right thing to slow down, to make sure they're doing extra checks and precautions. Because to be honest, we have seen the rest of the industry take 2 years to catch up from a model functionality standpoint. Think about it. GPT-4 was released more than a year ago. And it's just now that you're starting to see some of the new companies release a model that's at that level. And so they can afford to slow down and put some more of this infrastructure in place.
Yeah, and I think that's probably good advice for any, planet-ending technology is that you want to just take your time on it,
Yes.
not to put too fine a point on it. And I think also, one of the points you made in your op-ed was that innovation can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to happen in the open source world. Certainly, we get massive advantages coming out of that, but big breakthroughs like the internet themselves, they came out of closed environments like the DoD.
Yep.
And a lot of other innovations that we see on a day-to-day basis generally happen, not entirely, but generally happen because there is some kind of competitive advantage to keeping them in a closed environment. And only once that's established itself do other competitors come up with improvements or other innovations on top of that. So yeah, I'm with you. I like an open source environment. I like the creative tension between having open source and closed. I like the fact that this is a conversation and that it forces people to think about this. I also love the fact that when there's two sides to an argument, because it allows us to see things differently. And there isn't that monopoly situation where, we've had in some industries where it's like one, almost all the spoils go to a single company.
I want to be very specific in terms of my rebuttal of what Mark said, because I don't want this to come off as something just very superficial that, hey, I'm opposing open source. I want to be clear. When you think of what Meta is doing, and Mark said it himself, the reason why they can afford to do this is because they're not a hyperscaler. They're not a cloud provider. They are not making money from the models themselves. They're looking to build products. And so it goes without saying that they can afford to say, hey, let's open source this technology. You don't see them saying the same thing with social media platforms like Facebook and with WhatsApp. They're not going to say, hey, let's open source this innovation that we have.
Yeah.
And so there's this honesty that you need to have as you look through the lens of this op-ed to recognize that this is in their interest, and that's why they're advocating for it now.
Right.
When you
it's in the interest of the market. I think that's what you're saying, is that it does help everybody get to a place of kind of uniform understanding. Like we all have access to this, similar to what Tesla did when they said, look, you can have all of our IP, you go and build EVs. They knew at some point that would come back to haunt them, because other EV company would be able to build a cheaper product, especially in China. And of course, there would be this, a kind of a general rising of the tide for the entire industry, which has benefited them in some ways, but also hurt them in a lot of other ways. So I think, like you said, it's who you are. It's the context specific. If you're an organization that has a specific focus on a certain kind of product, then building these kinds of tools helps everybody become a little bit more competitive, helps everybody become a little bit more interested in the topic. In general, it's just more access, as you said. And then they can go out on a buying spree and say, well, look, this small startup in Africa used Lama to create this amazing tool. We're gonna buy that, just like they acquired WhatsApp, they acquired Instagram. Their biggest wins have been acquisitions, not internal innovations. And I think that's something that people have to keep reminding themselves is, whenever we see Meta trying to innovate on their own, they're not that great. Let's just be honest. Like the metaverse was a bit of a dead on arrival idea.
Hey, leave the metaverse alone. It's coming. All right.
Yeah, whatever. We'll see. And even some of the product, the stuff that kind of gets you there, the physical consumer products that get you there. That's never really been their thing, but they're really good at making deals. They're really good at getting acquisitions done, and they're really good at leveraging those and making them into multi-billion-dollar opportunities. So I think you have to see this in the context of what it is. It's Meta and Llama. It's not like Microsoft and Llama or Google and Llama. It's like a slightly different kind of equation.
Yeah, 100%. And so there's another layer to this in terms of open source AI specifically that I want to touch on. When Mark says, hey, this is open source, it really isn't, though, is it? Anybody
it doesn't look like it.
in this space knows that it's a play on words. It's they're taking a lot of liberty with the words open, and as you know, if it's open source, you'd have access to the code, the model weights, You'd have access to the data, the training data. And so you'd have everything that you need to basically go out and replicate this, right?
Well, he
But the
learned this
reality,
lesson from Sam, right? I mean, OpenAI was like this, supposed to be a non-profit, was supposed to be open to everybody. Turns out that wasn't the case either. So I think he learned that little
well,
trick from OpenAI.
well, I'll defend Sam here. When they open sourced their initial models, they open sourced everything. They showed you the inner workings. They showed you how it was built. I don't know if they released the data sets, the training data, but the point is this around the Llama releases and when companies claim that they're open sourcing their models, there is one layer that's open weights, which is what you're seeing with Mark Zuckerberg and Lama. Then Apple, for example, or AI 21, they released actual open source models where they release everything. You can take it and you can go and train your own model from the ground up, and you'd be fully in control. What you're seeing with the Meta and Llama is that this is a handout almost. They're saying, hey, we made this amazing model. Hey, you can go and take it and use it however you want to use the model that we made, that we trained with our data, that we
Right,
put our own guardrails on. And so
right.
it's a completely different approach versus true open source. And that has repercussions for all the arguments that Mark is making. So as an example, with AI, the benefit with traditional open source software is that everybody would be contributing. If there's a security issue, everybody would like chip in to fix it, and it would get pushed back up to master, and then everybody would have a better model. With Llama, if you find an issue, if you are working on an innovation within it, there is no way for you to push that back up to the master that everyone can benefit from.
Right.
You will create a different
I mean,
fork.
you can submit a ticket, but there's no chance. There's zero chance that somebody's going to actually notice.
Exactly, right? Like there are thousands of these different forks of Llama, and none of the advantage of bringing all that learning back into the core
Yeah,
to benefit everyone. And so what do?
yeah,
You wait until the next Llama release. And as usual, Meta now becomes that benefactor to the rest of the
yeah.
industry. And the question is, how is that very different from an open AI who is essentially doing the same thing? And so this is an oversimplification, of course, but the point I'm making is that it's not all roses when it comes to their approach to open source. There are massive security implications then. But we have to recognize that a lot of these models, we don't fully understand some of their capabilities until they're released. There are things that OpenAI learned about GPT after it was being used by people. And the risk that we're saying is, hey, let's take this technology, let's give it to everyone. We think it's secure. We have done our safety checks, but we've seen Google do safety checks, and look how that turned out for them, right? And so if you were building a nuclear weapon and you learned how to do cold fusion, would you think because your adversaries can spy and find out that you should just release it to everybody? Is it a really good idea to release open source technology? I'm not against hearing opposing points of view. In fact, the point of AI literacy and us doing op-eds like this is to spark conversation. We want to get the other side of the story. We want to hear more from the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. We want them to defend their position versus them just being allowed to parrot talking points and everybody saying, yes, this is true. Like we want to be able to, as a society, have higher level conversations as to what this means for us, what the technology means from a security standpoint, and how we can do it in a responsible way.
So bottom line is, don't trust Meta. Don't trust OpenAI.
Don't trust anybody.
Don't trust anybody.
Yeah, but the op-ed is on Maginative.com. We'll add the links to it. I dive into additional thoughts and questions that I'd love to be discussed publicly. And the other side to this was the response that not a response, but Sam Altman's op-ed in the Washington Post, where he talks about the importance of U.S. leadership in AI development, especially if we want the democratic values that we hold dear within Western societies to be the direction that AI innovation supports and takes. Now, I think it's important. I think it's important that we're thinking and talking about the investment that needs to be made here from an infrastructure standpoint. The reason this op-ed started in the first place is because I said pointedly to a conversation that was happening on LinkedIn, I said, where is the government in all of this? When it comes to
Right.
open source, a private company shouldn't be the one funding open source. If you actually believe that you want to release technology that's beneficial to everybody, this is what taxpayer dollars should be going to funding from a technology standpoint. You should be building these models openly. You should be investing in how you can improve security and access to these models, how you can develop the infrastructure that's needed. But the government has been really missing in all of this. Like this week, yesterday, I think they announced that Apple had signed on to the voluntary security and safety measures that the White House had put out. And the question is, should these be voluntary? Should we be waiting a year down the road after this was announced for Apple to finally say, hey, you know what? We're going to follow these these recommendations also.
Yeah, I mean, every industry has its, FDA or FCC or SEC. Like all of the industries already have regulatory bodies, and these are bodies that, in general, have really, really smart people working for them, and have, in most cases, very particular powers that they can enact on these things. The problem is we've had an administration that hasn't really put the screws on any of these things. They haven't put the screws on technology companies in general. That's why we've seen such a shit show with social media. They haven't put the screws on those, Silicon Valley companies specifically, because that's where the growth is, right? The Magnificent Seven contribute a significant amount of growth to the market. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to kind of lean into something that I've been thinking about a lot, and will probably be an op-ed on Maginative soon. And that is, as we see these shifts happening, these kind of the big decisions as to like where this technology is going, there are existing industries, there are existing players that are being affected directly. So let's just kind of frame this. Whenever there's a change happening, when there's a market change, when there's a big shift, businesses have to follow suit. They have to change with that market. And what we see is very often individual companies are not making the choices to transform ahead of these market changes. They're actually being forced to make the changes by what is going on in the market. So, hey, if you're one of the many members of EO that are receiving our AI literacy workshops, you're asking questions. You're saying, like, how is this affecting my company? You weren't thinking about this 5 years ago. You certainly weren't even thinking about this 2 years ago. And now suddenly you're, wow, this is all I'm thinking about. What's AI going to mean for me? And in particular, the industry that I'm very close to, and I see a lot of reactive decisions being made, is in the SaaS space. Now, I know you've got a very strong opinion about this. You believe SaaS is essentially dead.
It's dead,
I
Richard.
think SaaS, dead. I think SaaS is on life support, but I think it's going to transform. The transformation needs to happen in spite of what people think and in spite of what they want. And let me just give you some numbers to kind of seed this conversation. So far this year, so far that's been like, essentially half a year, 2024. Enterprises have spent about $154 billion on AI solutions. This is a significant amount of money. And what's interesting about that is two things. One is, where is this money coming from? Right? The natural thing is, well, it's not brand new money. It's not printing money. So it has to come from somewhere. And then the second thing is, who ultimately benefits or gets hurt by those choices? So if about 20% of the total SaaS spend is now going to AI, that means that money is not going to SaaS, or it's going to AI washed SaaS. So some SaaS companies are coming out and say, well, we're AI, so you can spend money with us and feel good about it. And you and I both know that that's bullshit. Like, most of these companies are not true AI. They have some kind of, maybe some basic machine learning built into there, or a chatbot or something like that. But they're not AI companies. Now, IDC is suggesting that there will be continued market growth of about 70% for AI between now and 2027. So let's put those numbers in perspective. If you're a SaaS company, you're starting to think, do we AI wash what we're doing and just kind of like ride the wave as long as we can? Or do you make the decision to think about like, well, what does the future look like where we are an AI-driven company? We are fundamentally, at our core AI. And as it has been in the past, you can't just kind of flip the switch, right? If you're a self-service company and you want to become enterprise, that's difficult. It's not in your DNA. It's a different sales motion, it's different marketing motions, different support models. And so saying, oh, we're a SaaS company today, but we're an AI company tomorrow, again, those are difficult choices. The reason why they're difficult is because human beings are involved in this equation. Whenever you're selling software or a solution or a platform to a company, you're not selling it to the company. Companies don't interact with companies. People interact with people. This is a people problem. This is not a what problem. This is a who problem, as it's always been. And the who problem is who's making the choices to buy this so-called AI software. I put in inverted commas because I don't truly believe that a lot of these softwares are like AI specific.
Yeah.
And the question then would be for those people is to say, okay, if we've got people making these decisions, how then is it adopted? How is it then implemented? How is it then used? And how do we justify the expense that we put into these new things? So $154 billion that these enterprises are spending, somebody eventually is going to have to check that bill. They're going to get the receipt and they're going to say, what's going on here? And that's normally the CFO or the CTO, right? They're the ones who are now going to be scratching their head saying, okay, we've got this stuff. How is it working? And to a point you made earlier, I think one of the things that needs to be considered is there are services, there are actual people services involved in implementing and adopting these technologies. If you are buying SaaS software, if you're buying enterprise software, if you're buying large-scale software for your organization, there is no ways that this is like a turnkey solution. You need to buy it with the services. There is a line item with every SaaS enterprise sale that says, here are the people that are going to help you find your way through this morass of complications. We're going to plumb it for you. We're also going to maintain it for you. We're going to train your people, and we're going to have the customer success people on staff to make sure that happens. Now, we are dealing with a situation where those people, the very people that are responsible for the training, the onboarding, the implementation, those are the people who are speculatively losing their jobs because so-called AI is going to replace them. So now we have this really interesting situation where we've got the things that people need, in other words, the services, are not necessarily going to be available to them to use these AI promises that they're buying. And so here's my big speculation, is that companies that are speculatively laying off people because AI is going to provide them with efficiencies or productivity gains, they will actually find that it's going to be very difficult to adopt the very technologies that they are buying. So yes, we will see continued spending in software and infrastructure, but because we're cutting people out of the equation, and we see this every single day, there's new, Intel's another good example. Not Intel, Intuit laid off, several thousand people last week because of underperforming. What an absolute disaster that was.
Yeah.
And they're laying off people because they're speculating that AI is going to fill the gap. But the problem is, if you don't know how to use this technology or plumb it into your organization, then how do you actually see those gains in the first place? So this is a interesting thing because between that, the fact that we've got this really interesting election year that we're in right now, and we haven't really seen AI as a product land yet. We've seen it as infrastructure, right? We've seen is that consulting services, like the McKinseys and everything, purporting that they know what they're doing. But we're not seeing it as a product. And as John Cutler says, we talk about software as a service, but we don't really talk about service as software, right? And this is a really interesting phrasing, because if we think about how we're going to then make the transition, make the transformation from where we are to where we're going to. We do need those services, and we're not investing in them. So what will happen? My guess, and again, just for anybody who's listening, this is not investment advice. We are not investors. We don't know what the hell we're doing when it comes to that. But what I would suggest is that you're only going to see a real kind of benefit to the software companies in a few years' time. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I think it's going to be a while before those actual benefits start landing. Because even if companies are buying your software, they're not going to be using it the way that you intended because they don't have the services to make it happen. And therefore, when it comes up for renewal, because ARR, the R in ARR is recurring. If it's not recurring, then it's not going to continue to provide you with the upside that you were looking for. And that's what we're measuring SaaS companies on. We're measuring software being sold as a recurring relationship. Then we've got a problem. So I think this is actually a really fun conversation to have. I don't believe entirely that SaaS is dead in the way that you do. I think it's just on life support because it's not making the right choices. And I do believe that there will be winners and losers like there are in every industry. There will be a lot of dead bodies on this road. A lot. However, a handful of companies will recognize that it's possible to make this transition. We've seen some of the Magnificent Seven do this. We've seen Microsoft do this. We've seen, I'd even throw Adobe in there just because they're doing such a good job with this. We're starting to see them make these really interesting choices about how they're going to productize AI. And those are the companies that will survive.
First, Richard, I can't wait to read this op-ed on Maginative. I think people are going to absolutely love it. No, I feel I need to defend myself. I've been really pushing the buttons with so many people on this for a while. That SaaS is dead.
A couple of years ago, if you really wanted to cause a shitstorm on social media, you used to say things like, should designers code? And now you say SaaS is dead.
So here's the thing. When I say SaaS is dead, I'm not speaking specifically to SaaS itself. Of course, even what OpenAI is offering is SaaS, right? I'm speaking to the business model around SaaS companies. I'm speaking to the value that they have historically delivered. And I am very opinionated on this because I see one implementation challenges that companies have had, but I also see this direction that AI is moving in. And it's going to conflict heavily with a lot of ways in which SaaS companies have made money in the past and how they have seen themselves adding value in the operations chain. So here are a couple of thoughts. Firstly, I do think, and these are going to be random, by the way, because there are so many things that you touched on that I want to address. I think some of the layoffs that you're seeing in the industry are also a repercussion of really poor hiring practices by companies that made bad decisions and that had overinflated valuations. And so I think what you're starting to see now is just this reality setting in that we're not going to hit that valuation target that everybody put on us that we so willingly accepted, or we were very irresponsible in terms of our hiring. And now we're recognizing that we're running out of money faster than we can innovate in this new reality. Because make no mistake, as you're saying, there's this massive shift in spend that's happening. One of the questions that I got from a member at EO this week, they said, hey, Chris, we got ChatGPT from OpenAI and we're a Microsoft shop, so we got Copilot. But now we're starting to see all of these different products that we use start to say that they have AI in them. And we're seeing all of this overlap that's happening. What do we do? Which products do we keep on using? And that is the rub, right? Like you're seeing what is called AI tourism, where companies will try a product, try an AI solution, and then after a while they go back home, right? And so I do think, to your point, there is going to be a lot of pain in the short term, both with the companies trying to figure out where they will fit in this new ecosystem, for companies trying to figure out what their strategy should be,
Mhm.
Where should they invest both short term and long term? And overall, is it a bad thing? Not necessarily. As you have said, this is just the way in which innovation and change happens. It's going to be messy. This is that messy middle that we're in right now that companies will need to navigate. The next thing I'll say is that image on your wall, that art, Richard, I wanted to just stop and call it out because as you're talking, I'm looking at it. And one, that is OpenAI's logo for ChatGPT. That's their representation of AI, by the way. And I think
A black hole.
it's just a black hole. It's just a dot, which is brilliant. But the
Yeah.
color around it, as you're talking, and we're talking about AI, I just kept on thinking, man, the square framing plus the circle plus the red color around
Well,
it.
it's an eclipse. For those of you who are not watching this, but you're listening to this,
Mm.
what I painted was what looks like a black hole, but it's actually an eclipse,
Wow.
and the radiance that is coming from around it. An eclipse means different things, right? So it obviously means a change, right? That's like traditionally and spiritually and kind of tribally, these things represented a big change. So, before there was OpenAI, there was just this idea that transformation was normally suggested by the celestial being, the
Yeah,
celestial bodies that, like, as the kind of the seasons changed. But the other part of an eclipse is that it gives us a moment to stop and think and say, look, well, what is this thing? Like, we're taking for granted the fact that the sun is shining, and then suddenly it's like obscured for a moment by the moon. And the question is, well, what is that? Why is this happening? And I think that's where we are right now. We've got
exactly.
this moment where we're reflecting on questions like, and I don't have like, again, this is not investment advice. I'm not saying like you should listen to what I say, but AI spending will result in a decrease in overall traditional SaaS spending and non-AI purchases in the short term, right? That is just, it's happening right now. There is evidence for that. You read the G2 reports, you read the IDC reports, you read the Gartner reports. It's happening, right? There's no like arguing that fact. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And does it matter? And then the second thing is, there will be a decrease in overall hiring, and there will be an increase in potential layoffs.
Yep.
And that is going to change the way that we are going to see how these things are implemented.
These are difficult questions to have, Richard, but they're important conversations that we should be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, hard questions are where the value is. So it totally, I advise anybody that is in this predicament to reach out to somebody who understands this space and have questions about their context. What we've got to warn everybody or caution everybody to is like this kind of generalized approach of like, hey, we're just going to do what everybody else is doing. What we are doing needs context. Every company is going to be different. Every industry is going to be different. Every geographic situation is going to inform differently. And so if you're in a particular sector, look very carefully at how you're going to adopt these technologies. Look very carefully at how you're going to make hiring choices, because it isn't obvious to everybody. And I think, even though I'm an optimist in the long term, I think short term, I think there's going to be a lot of pain, a lot of frustration, a lot of anxiety, and just like a lot of misinformation.
Right.
I don't think it's malicious misinformation.
Yeah.
I think it's just companies are doing what companies are doing. They are going to AI wash the hell out of what they're doing because they have to, because they will need to stay current. They need to stay relevant. They're so worried that they're going to be considered as irrelevant. And we're actually, I'm advising a couple of companies right now where we're having these conversations, like just how much AI do we put into the conversation? Never mind in the product.
Yep.
Do we even mention it? Do we talk about AI? Do we talk about automation? Do we talk about machine learning? How do we wrap this up? And in one case, one of the companies that I advise has chosen to ignore that conversation entirely and actually lean in on the people problems. Like, how is this affecting the individuals and the teams within your organizations? So I think these are necessary conversations. There are no black and white answers. There are no like specific, like, do this, but there are very good ways facilitated ways to get to the answers for your business or for your industry. And as you pointed out, this eclipse over my shoulder, I'm going to point out the fact that the palm tree behind you looks like green wings of an angel. And as everybody knows, Chris is so smart. He sometimes sounds like he's coming from the heavens with his information and with his wisdom. So
Well,
yeah, maybe that's a good place to wrap this up. I know I need another cup of coffee. My son just came back from the Dominican Republic, so I'd like to see him.
well, I agree. Such a great conversation, always, Richard, with you. I could talk a lot more about this. I would say if you're a company, if you're a business leader, and you're interested in having this conversation, if you have questions like we do, as Richard mentioned, we're training companies all over the world right now. Richard has written books on product leadership, on a lot of leadership insight that you need to have as an organization, especially navigating times like today where everything is shifting so rapidly. Definitely subscribe, like the video if it made sense. If you have comments, if you have feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe on Maginative if you're interested in getting a digest of the news. And overall, find us on social media. We're typically hanging out on X or on LinkedIn. Send us a message. We'd love to respond and interact with you. But until next week, have a great weekend and one love.
Ciao.